Hey there guys, this is Paul Santamore doing my Industrial Revolution student sample for Practicum 2012 in the fall semester. Today I'm basically going to talk about 4 implications brought out from the Industrial Revolution that connect to modern society. I'm going to give you guys some facts and things that you might understand in order to make the correlations between the two. The first point I'd like to make is in reference to the environment and the connections from the Industrial Revolution to today. Basically, during the Industrial Revolution, there was a lot of chemical industries. There were paper mills, there were sawmills, there were different textile mills, such as where I'm from in Saco, Biddeford, we had a huge mill down there, the pepper mills. And the implications on today were brought about by the chemicals that were actually just dumped into the river as if they were sewage back in those times in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Basically today it can still be seen in places as diverse as Jay and Livermore, Maine, which are 15 miles down the road. You can also see it in Auburn. And the reason you can see it in those two places specifically is because the Androscoggin River runs through there. And on the Androscoggin River, starting all the way up in Errol, New Hampshire, and coming all the way down to Brunswick, Maine, where the river finally falls off into the ocean, there were huge textile mills and pulp mills for paper. So those industries really were just dumping a ton of chemicals down into the river, and it was tragic because there were no environmental regulations at the time. Late 1800s, early 1900s, industry was just booming and they were making a ton of money, so people thought it was all optimism. Well, in the end of the early 1900s, people started to get a little concerned because the rivers were frothing with orange foam. The Androscoggin actually has been, there were fires on the Androscoggin 5 times recorded in history. So this brought about the Clean Air and Water Act and actually started to form what today is the EPA. So obviously the implications can be seen today, but I think it's a lot harder for us today because in modern times we've had so many regulations, and today you can swim in the Androscoggin River, you can swim in the Saco River. But back then, I did an oral history last semester for my aunt, and she gave stories about walking across the river from Saco to Biddeford on the bridge and to visit her grandmother, and they actually had to plug their nose for the whole 100 yards that they were on the bridge because the fumes and the air was so noxious that it almost made them want to pass out. So the connections to today are obvious, and I think that the environmental debate is still obviously going on today. But the Industrial Revolution definitely did have a negative effect on the environment, in my opinion. The second point is more of a social and cultural point. It is to say that young kids and adults even were positively affected by the Industrial Revolution. You may ask why. In the Industrial Revolution, there were a lot of, you've probably heard the stories, once again in reference to the mills, there were kids working, crawling through the looms, almost being losing limbs, hands, feet, and even adults. They were getting paid menial wages, barely getting fed, working 15-hour days, and then going to a second job possibly. And I just see these as the travesties of the Industrial Revolution that actually led to positive things in the end, which all of my points did to some point. Basically, the things that came out of the Industrial Revolution in terms of children were the child labor laws. Kids can't work when they're under 14 years old. At 14 they need a permit. After that their work week is controlled. There's only a certain amount of hours allotted for children. There is a minimum wage that goes for kids and adults as well, even though most adults were making more than the minimum wage back then because the industries were just booming. They were selling textiles across the country, all across the world. The paper industry was huge. Newspaper, books, they didn't have the internet like we do. Everything was print. So the industries were booming, but there was a lot of injustice happening within the population as well. So I think it's really beneficial that we had these child labor laws. And in the book, out of many that I'm using for a class textbook, it really describes how these kids were just being almost in torturous work conditions. So we're obviously glad that in modern times there's child labor laws, but these injustices still are being fought against in other countries and other parts of the world as well. So there's still some work to be done. My third point is that the Industrial Revolution really diversified how we live and where we live. in the United States today. In 1860, there were only 9 American cities with over 100,000 inhabitants, and for that period of time, that's a lot of people. Those cities were cities like New York, Baltimore, Chicago, Boston, and by 1918, there were 38 cities. So within a 30-year span, there were 30 more cities than previously that had 100,000 people. This is because the industries were able to be built around the natural resources that were actually found near these big cities. Rivers, oceans, roads, anything. So basically, people would come to these places to work in the factories. In Chicago, it was the meat industry. Up here in Maine, there weren't massive cities, but there were urban centers: Saco, Biddeford, Lewiston, Auburn, Bangor, Waterville, and Winslow. So we can make obvious connections today, but yeah, the Industrial Revolution just diversified it. It brought people to the cities. They needed money. They could no longer make it in subsistence farming out in the country. The markets were opening up within the cities. Merchants were selling goods, and the market economy was growing. My fourth and final point is basically addressing how that market economy that I spoke of previously really began to get started and how it's still alive today. Although pure capitalism is not really alive and well today, as we can see with our economy, we're still in one of the biggest recession since the Great Depression, which actually shortly followed the Industrial Revolution. These market economies developed first starting they were over in Britain earlier, in Europe, and those countries were really thriving. And then obviously we are a branch off of the European countries, Britain in particular. And the market economy really started to boom here because we were making such mass quantities of goods that they no longer could be sold at a simple farmer's market. Storefronts were opening up, privatizing the business. It was interesting because we had these rich men: Andrew Carnegie doing steel, Vanderbilt doing the railroads. We had meat packing plants. We had, anything. We had Ford starting with cars. So these plants were employing huge amounts of people and putting out so many goods that they no longer could be simply sold at a market. They had to be sold. There were magazines, Sears and Roebuck, selling the textile goods. There were car dealerships. There were people that were just becoming so rich off this market economy, but there were also downsides, and that's what we start to see today, is that now as you can enhance technology and modernize, you can basically put people out of jobs but still have that same productivity. So the point that I'm trying to make is that the Industrial Revolution really, as a whole, it did some good things, and it did some bad things. Those bad things really they can go either way. With a capitalist economy, you can come out of a downturn quickly. You could have a huge boom like we did in the Industrial Revolution, but it's not always going to stay that way. So what we're kind of going to have to deal with, whether it be environmentally, socially, or economically, is the upturns and downturns that are evident from the Industrial Revolution. From that time period all the way to this time period, we've had downturns, we've had upturns, highs and lows, but the American society has really grown from the Industrial Revolution as a whole, and I think it was, if not the most integral, one of the most integral parts of the American story.